Punishing Russia on every front over its war in Ukraine. Back-to-back summits in Brussels begin, with NATO outlining troop deployments to bulk up its eastern flank.
Let's pick up on the NATO meeting in Brussels. Ross Cullen joins us for more on this. Ross, the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg says that NATO is determined to impose costs on Russia to end this war. We've had a month of measures. What kind of action are we expecting?
Yes, you're right, Dawn, that today, March the 24th, is marking now 4 weeks of war in Ukraine, of a refugee crisis in the wider European region. NATO, the summit that's being held here in Brussels, that's the first one of the day. We have G7 meetings after that, and then European Union meetings. But the first one with Jens Stoltenberg, President Biden of the United States, also attending to try to find unity, a coordinated response, providing further military assistance, humanitarian aid to Ukraine, as well as doubling down, as you say, reinforcing the eastern flank, sending troop deployments, new combat-ready battle groups in 4 different countries, in Slovakia, Bulgaria, Hungary, and also we've heard from the Romanian government as well. Please, there is going to be an additional troop deployment to Romania as well, one of the countries that is both in the European Union and NATO that borders Ukraine. So there are going to be discussions today about further unity, demonstrating transatlantic unity. The Canadian Prime Minister is also here. And then there will be discussions at G7 level, including the Japanese Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, is here in Brussels in person, leading a Japanese delegation for representation at the G7 summit to try to move on sanctions. But when it comes to NATO, yes, it's more a focus on military assistance to Ukraine where they can, and also humanitarian aid. But the idea of a no-fly zone, something that brings them into direct contact with Russia's forces, is also off the table for the moment, something that NATO does not want to consider.
Indeed. Ukraine may have NATO's unity, but President Zelensky also wants a bit more than that. He's urged them to give Ukraine more military assistance, more aid. Are they going to give President Zelensky what he needs?
Well, there certainly are going to be continued deliveries from different European Union and non-EU states. We've seen the UK say it's going to increase the number of anti-tank weapons it's going to be sending, missiles as well, and also personal protective equipment. The idea that also you need millions of dollars to be sent into Ukraine, also just to support the salaries of military personnel, armed forces service personnel as well. So there are going to be different strategies of how that aid can continue to flow into Ukraine to support it militarily, and also the humanitarian side as well. You mentioned President Zelensky. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, has been making a series of video addresses to parliaments around the world, the US Congress, speaking to Japanese MPs, French senators. He's going to be speaking to European Union, making an address to the G7 as well. Another plea for more support for Ukraine, further isolation for Russia. Now that it marks 1 month of this war, he's called for March the 24th to be the day when there are protests around Europe in support of Ukraine, and support of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government trying to stand up to this ongoing Russian operation, what the Kremlin has described as a special military operation inside Ukraine. We are likely to see another impassioned plea in this video address we expect from Volodymyr Zelensky. He says that Ukraine will remember its friends and partners, but will also remember those who sold out the country. And so we expect that speech a little bit later on, and we'll be monitoring that before dawn. The G7 summit begins, and then after that, the European Union summit. So a lot of diplomacy here in Brussels today.
All right, Ross, thank you very much for that. Ross Cullen there reporting from Brussels.
The focus of NATO discussions is a reset of Europe's security architecture. Part of NATO's response is the deployment of 4 new battle groups in Eastern Europe, in Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary and Slovakia. That brings the total number of battle groups in the East to 8. Battle groups in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland have around 5,000 troops. In total, NATO has around 40,000 personnel on its eastern border from the Baltics to the Black Sea. NATO forces outnumber Russians in every category. The Western alliance has almost 5.5 million military personnel in total, compared to Russia's 1.3 million. In the air, NATO has more than 20,000 warplanes, Russia 4,000. The alliance has more than 115,000 armoured vehicles. On the ground, Russia has 30,000. At sea, NATO has 2,000 ships, including 17 aircraft carriers. Russia has 600 ships with 1 aircraft carrier. For a closer look at NATO's plans to boost its military presence, I'm joined by Dr. Taras Kuzio, Associate Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Dr. Kuzio, now you wrote before the invasion in January on the need for, and I quote you, more funding and forces in the event of an escalation. What we have seen from NATO and the allies, including yesterday's announcement, is that enough?
No, of course not. I mean, NATO and Western countries seem to be willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. There is a need for 2 particular areas, and they are a total embargo on the export of Russian oil and gas to any Western democracy, European, North American democracy. Germany and Hungary are resisting that, but that would severely wreck the Russian economy, because about 40 to 50% of government budget is from those sales. And I don't think it's right to say we need time to reduce our dependency. There are other alternatives available from Azerbaijan, from Central Asia, from Algeria, Morocco already. And secondly, the biggest area, I mean, anti-tank weapons are great, and Ukraine has been using them to deadly effect. But the key problem area is Russian missiles destroying Ukraine's buildings, roads, architecture, infrastructure, and killing civilians and creating this huge refugee crisis. I mean, something like a quarter of Ukraine's population are either refugees or IDPs, internally displaced people. So Ukraine needs something to counter those Russian missiles, which are being fired from the Black Sea, from Belarus, and from Russian territory. Sort of surface-to-air anti-aircraft weaponry is now coming in, and Ukraine is knocking out Russian airplanes. But the missiles are creating, it's the missiles that completely obliterated, for example, the port of Mariupol. So those areas, I think, are very important. Just a quick point about your comparison, Russia and NATO on the military side. I don't think it's a great comparison, because we're comparing numbers that both sides have declared. And as we've seen from Ukraine, Russian weaponry is in a terrible state of condition. There's a lot of corruption. The equipment doesn't work. It's outdated. Russian troops are supplied with outdated meals. I mean, including 7-year-old rations are being found on Russian troops. So I think that what the war has shown is that the Russian army is in even far worse condition than you've described it in terms of a comparison with NATO. I mean, if a Ukrainian army can battle the Russian army to a stalemate within 1 month, think about NATO. It would have basically defeated Russia within 1 to 2 weeks.
So President Zelensky's request made in the last few hours to NATO that he wants, thank you for the defense equipment, but now he wants offensive weapons. That is something NATO can do, will do, and will that be what turns the tide finally in the current stalemate?
Well, there's a need for 2 things. Firstly, yet again, I'll reiterate the question of kind of knocking missiles out of the sky before they do tremendous damage and kill civilians. And secondly, to give the type of equipment that would help the Ukrainian forces to go on the counteroffensive. Ukrainian forces have fought the Russian forces to a stalemate. Russian forces are no longer advancing. They're retreating in most areas, slowly, and they're not likely now to take the capital city of Kiev and other big cities. So there needs to be equipment given to the Ukrainians to push the advantage, to start pushing the Russian forces back, If that starts happening, then the Russian leadership will be will be in disarray, and they then will be forced to come to some kind of negotiated compromise. But it's only through that sort of forcing the Russians onto a back foot, as it were, forcing them on the defensive, getting them to lose ground. For example, there are places near the capital city of Kiev where Russian forces are completely surrounded, which could be their Stalingrad. I mean, if those are all destroyed or captured, it would be a disaster for the Russian forces. So that kind of thing needs to be promoted.
All right, thanks so much for that, Dr. Taras Kozio from the Henry Jackson Society.
Singaporean Ixchen joins us live now from Poland. He and his family were living in Kyiv for several months before moving towards Poland for safety. Ix, good to see you again. US President Joe Biden, he's on his way to Poland to meet with President Duda tomorrow. As the closest he's come to the sort of front line of this war between Russia and Ukraine. Have you noticed any significant buzz or interest among the Polish public with his arrival?
Yes. Actually, what was on a lot of people's topic yesterday was actually the expulsion of 45 Russian diplomats from the Polish side. And that seems to be a step up from the Poland end in terms of this. So what is the average, honestly average, at least a few Polish friends that we have met up with seems to be on their mind is how much of Poland involvement is going to be in this Ukraine and Russian conflict.
Ix, you continue to stay safe there in Poland. Thanks for speaking with us as well. Ixchen there.